our, our recollection and our write-up for the following activities. We've got 3 hours of lightning talks and open discussion to look forward to, covering interoperability and open access to risk data and models, innovation of digital platforms and tools to meet the needs of the most vulnerable, and leveraging digital public goods and communities for enhancing skills and risk communication. Prior to those 3 sessions, we'll have 3 shorter sessions serving to provide an overview of the current state of digital public goods from Pierre Chinovsky, who's the lead for digital data at GFDRR. Before that, we'll receive an introduction to digital public goods from Lucy Harris from Unicef, who's co-chair of the Digital Public Goods Alliance. But first we will have Jenty Kirsch-Wood, UNDRR's Head of Global Risk Management and Reporting, and also co-chair of the Insurance Development Forum Risk Modelling Steering Group, who will provide some welcome remarks and provide an overview of today's objectives. Over to you, Jenty.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Stuart, and thanks very much, colleagues, for joining today. Actually, we'd like today to be very much of an informal session, and this really is coming about as a deepening of the partnership between UNDRR and GFDRR around collaborating on implementation of the Sendai framework. We're looking at areas around, obviously, risk knowledge and analysis, but also on trying to make sure that the frameworks and the basis for digital public goods is strengthened. We see this as a real contributor to improving the modeling baseline, but also improving the opportunities for collaboration in accelerating Sendai and also the SDGs. So I don't want to speak for long, but I just want to highlight, I really hope today's discussion can be constructive in helping get the dialogue going again about the idea of creation of public goods, about expanding risk knowledge networks, and about sharing experience about some of the good and quite innovative work going on across our organizations to look at its strengthening of risk management approaches and looking at some of the transformations that we're going to need to get our risk modeling systems up and compatible and interoperable. So I hope that today's discussion can partly take a look at the paper that we've worked on as a draft, and we think there are some good advocacy points in there, but we'd really like feedback and suggestions. But I also hope that it can help engender some dialogue that can hopefully extend beyond today's meeting on making sure that the next generation of analytics is more standardized, more interoperable, and more compatible to being able to look across the range of systemic risks that we're facing, so that we can really see them applied more universally in countries where they're most needed. So I think I'll stop there, but I just want to thank you all very much for taking time. And I think that today's discussion is a really important opportunity to share experience and to hopefully begin to connect some of the dots on a number of different interesting initiatives from the participants here today, and to try to see whether or not we can get good standardization of terminology where it's possible, good standardization of open source data, that we can link to some initiatives such as the graph within the UNDRR, which is looking at developing information portals to generate or at least make a one-stop shop for risk data. But we know that there are also good similar initiatives within the GFDRR and the humanitarian community. So really to see what's out there and also to create some of those connections. I'd really like to thank all of the participants, but also colleagues at GFDRR, who've been, I think, really fantastic in leading this initial charge. And just to really state that I think it's a really good opportunity for strength and collaboration across the UN system and obviously with the wider IFI networks. So I'll stop there, and thanks very much, and look forward to diving into the discussions. Over to you.
Thanks, Jenty. We'll pass to Lucy Harris from Unicef. Lucy, you should be able to share your screen if you have slides to cover your presentation.
I have done away with slides in the spirit of making this a little more formal, and I will also try and keep it brief. So yeah, my name is Lucy Harris, and I co-lead the Digital Public Goods Alliance. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the DPGA, sorry, new acronym, which is what we all needed, is a multilateral initiative, and we were created in response to recommendation 1B from the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on digital cooperation. That panel took place in 2019, and there was also a subsequent report that defined digital public goods as open source software, open data, open AI models, open standards, and open content that adheres to privacy and other applicable laws, best practices, and helps attain the Sustainable Development Goals. So as the Digital Public Goods Alliance, we're focused on stewarding that definition of digital public goods, but also kind of connecting initiatives and creating collaboration within the UN system and beyond the UN system around digital public goods. So our initiative was co-founded by Unicef and the government of Norway, alongside the government of Sierra Leone and the think tank iSpirit. And starting in 2022, UNDP and the government of Germany, BMZ, will also be joining the leadership of the Digital Public Goods Alliance. But we have many member organizations from within the UN system, but also public and private sector players that are working to advance digital public goods for the Sustainable Development Goals. As I said, one of the main things we do as part of the DPGA is kind of connecting people who are working on digital public goods together and identifying places where we can reduce duplication. And we do this partially through communities of practice. And I wanted to briefly discuss a community of practice that we're working on right now, focused on climate change adaptation, which I think is relevant to the conversations hopefully we'll be having over the next few hours. And I wanted to bring up some of the major challenges that have been identified through the conversations we've had with the climate change adaptation community of practice, thinking that it'll be interesting to hear from you all. Are these kind of similar challenges you have when you're looking at disaster risk reduction, or are they things where you've already started to find some solutions? So the three key themes that came up in that community of practice around digital public goods, especially within weather and climate, which is the focus of that discussion, was the first is awareness. Just finding that there's a real lack of awareness on why kind of having open data available is critical, how it needs to be used to inform policies and actions, and what kind of opportunities there are to make data more available, how you might exchange it, and why that's important for potential impact. The second, and I'm sure this is common across so many fields, but of course, is resources. That there's a shortfall of financial and technical support that would be needed to adequately collect, store, distribute data, especially within the context of low and middle income countries. And also seeing this tension that as there's increasing recognition that especially kind of meteorological data has value, that then convincing people to distribute it freely or share it openly becomes more difficult. And so that there's a tension there as you start tackling the awareness issue and people understand why it's important, then encouraging people to share it openly, making it available as a public resource becomes more challenging. And the third piece is around policies, practices, and standards, that they're missing kind of standards for how things would be distributed in a standard format that makes interoperability really possible, but also making sure that there are policies and practices in place within countries that want to start using open data or other digital public goods like open software. Those practices and policies are missing, make it very difficult to create, but also procure or work with open solutions. So those three things around awareness, resources, policies, practices, and standards. I'm curious to, as I participate and also learn from you all today, to see how that comes up. And I'm very excited that this group is gathered within the context of digital public goods to think about how it can be applied and how we can do more with them. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lucy. Fantastic summary and really clear lines. Pierre, do you want to come in with your overview of the state of public goods currently?
Of course, and actually I did some slides. I'm going to share that with you. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fysh, so I'm part of the GFDRR team. I'm really happy to have you all today. I think we are almost 40 now, so it's great to see so many people joining for this workshop. So as an introduction, I'm going to try to give you a brief overview of where we are in terms of technologies for disaster reduction and also for climate change adaptation, and where we are in terms of the digital public goods part of those different technologies and why does that matter. So I tried to do a very brief history of digital public goods and how we came here. And so I found that first publication from Mr. Richardson in the latest century regarding the first model of weather prediction. It was in 1922. And it was the first time someone tried to do a modelization and to predict what would be the weather of tomorrow and what would be the potential consequences of that weather on people, and which is mainly cited as one of the first or milestone of climate change models. Then a big leap forward, and we are now in 1986, and the first catastrophe model developed by Mrs. Karen Clark, who then founded the air company. So like it was not really a digital public good, and actually she founded a company on top of it, but it was the first time someone really tried to not only capture information on the hazard, but also the information to capture information and model information on potential impact of hazards. So that was for insurance companies, and so that they could predict their exposure to catastrophes. And then, so still on that journey of catastrophe models, so we are now in 2014, and for the first time, we had like a consortium on reinsurance companies that decided to put together an open framework for catastrophe models. So recognizing that the fact that interoperability matters even for commercial endeavors, and that it was the digital public goods was needed in catastrophe modelization. Looking at another angle of disaster risk response, I think you all know about the Haiti earthquake of 2010 and the response from the OpenStreetMap community. So if you don't know OpenStreetMap, it's really like the Wikimedia of maps where anyone can contribute. And so when the earthquake struck in Haiti, there was no map of the capital. And in about 30 days, a community of about 600 contributors really mapped the entire capital city so that people could respond to the disaster. And I think it was really a trigger for, at least for the international community, on how they perceive digital public goods and how they perceive the potential impact and value of such services. And so if you look at the, let's say, the key success factors and why actually the OpenStreetMap platform was so powerful for that response. So, well, the first thing is that, of course, you had the underlying infrastructure, so digital infrastructures, web technologies, and many of them are actually open, and so digital public goods. But you also had an established community of people who were trained and to contribute, but also to collaborate through that platform. Then you have also another important aspect, which was the release of satellite data, very accurate and imageries of the country released in the public domain, so that contributors could use them for creating the map. And last, you also had the acceptance of the users. And I think here the international community really played a role, and we will be, I think, able to discuss later the importance of not only the international community, but also people on the ground, local governments, to accept the use of technologies such as digital public goods. And I think so since then, we saw last decade proliferation really of digital public goods in the sector of disaster risk reduction, from special data infrastructure such as GeoNode, GeoServer, and so on, products such as Unicef that is used to evaluate potential impact of given hazard in a given location. Some foundations that really focused on developing technologies, digital public goods technologies for disaster risk management, such as SANA Foundation. Consortium also active in the digital public goods sphere, such as the OGC Consortium, who recently launched pilot activity on disasters, and many other platforms. And I also wanted to see the humanitarian data exchange platform, which I think is really a key, key platform to find and access data for humanitarian purposes, but not only. It's also used widely within the bank for disaster risk management and other purposes. So now looking at the, let's say, the map of stakeholders, the ecosystem of stakeholders and the drivers, the different drivers behind those technologies. So I think there is like two different dimensions. One is, so you have different contexts and different countries with different, let's say, maturity in terms of data availability. So from, the countries where you have like very efficient statistical system, open data initiatives, and so on, to the countries, and most of them are developing countries, where it's very difficult, as you know, to find and collect information and to have regular and up-to-date information, even basic information. And on another line, you have all the stakeholders that are involved in disaster risk reduction. So on one side, you have the reinsurance sector, who has been really key in developing new technologies, like such as, again, catastrophe models, but for commercial purpose. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have, like many of us today, development and humanitarian people who have been driving the development of technologies, but then for the purpose of supporting developing countries and the most vulnerable population. And I think in the center, so I put them in the center, but you have also the academic and people like doing the research that can be, then picked up by companies or by development organizations, by NGOs. So really we are at the center of the innovation of that. And the interest here, and I think the interest of digital public goods, is to be able to build bridges between all those different stakeholders and between all those different initiatives, so that what is being developed in developed countries today can be applied tomorrow in developing countries, and for the benefit of humanitarian also assistance. So now we can also ask ourselves the question of what is the role of the private sector in advancing digital public goods. And I think here it's important to stress that, like it's not to say that we want all the technologies to be digital public goods. I think the question is more, what are the key pieces of technologies that we want to see as digital public goods, because there is an importance for disaster risk reduction, and because also there is an opportunity for the private sector to play a role and to advance all of that. And I think it's key to innovation, something that we will discuss in session 2. And here, just an example of a contribution of private sector to the OpenStreetMap platform, which I think is really interesting to see the wide, footprint and interest of private sector companies in having an entire map of the world. So we could also ask ourselves, where are the dark spots, and how to contribute to remove those spots so that we have a complete map of the world. And then the second question is about institutions like public institutions, NGOs, and so on, and what is their roles in advancing digital public goods for disaster risk reduction. So we define more or less four categories, but there may be many others in how we can play a role. So one is to own a product. So where we say own a product is to be the lead of a digital public goods, and to decide to do that because this technology doesn't exist and there is no, like private companies or anyone else actually in charge of developing that piece of software or piece of data. You could also decide to be a contributor to an existing digital public good, such as many of us do with, like again, the example of OpenStreetMap or the example of the Humanitarian Data Exchange platform, where we contribute with data. You could also decide to be an investor, and in that case, investing in an existing piece of software or data set or model, because there is an interest for you, or there is an interest for your client. Or you could also act as an advisor because you know the demand, because you can also facilitate the exchange of information between people on the ground and the people who are actually developing those technologies. Or you could also decide to do nothing because you think that innovation happens everywhere and you don't have to drive it. So again, just some examples, but would be curious to discuss that with you. And now I think we are now facing a new cycle of innovations, and something that's going to be really key in the way we serve people and in the way we can harness digital technologies to do that. So I'm going to list a few, but there are many new technologies that we can integrate in that digital value chains. For instance, Earth observation technologies. So we had lots of satellites, but now we have new type of satellites that can really go deep into the ground and capture many type of information, combined with the power of artificial intelligence to detect features, to, for instance, build maps at scale. So really that's changed the paradigm. I think 3D technologies, the way we can also create maps like with LiDAR or with other type of technologies or sensors, to not only look at the 2D dimension of hazard and exposure, but to also look at all the details of a city and how that can interplay with the different hazard scenario. There is also all that work around, using mobile data, so data captured from sensors such as GPS, mobile phone, and so on, and how that can inform, like for instance, the displacement of population or how people react in the event of a disaster. So of course, like we are talking about private information, but I think there is here, a potential, but also risk in using this information, and that raises a question for us, and also a question of what should be the pieces here that could be, should be made public to actually protect people, but also to be able to reuse this information. Something that would be good also to discuss. And the last one I wanted to show is that, so like what we call data science notebooks. So here it's a Jupyter notebook. So the possibility for anyone to actually run code script online and be able to tap into like various sources of information and very rapidly have a result. So we are now seeing, a boom also in data science careers, and lots of people getting like curriculum into that domain. So something that also to be taken into account. And of course, there are lots of risk, and sometimes also it can be just a risk of reputation or backlash for a company, but so can also be a risk of harming people when you use technologies in the wrong way, or you apply, like a disaster risk assessment with inaccurate information. So now, just to finish and also to start the discussions, we wanted to pinpoint some of the challenges ahead in terms of disaster risk information and climate change adaptation, and how digital public goods could help, and what we need to do. So, for instance, I think so. One of the things that we are going to see in the near future, in combination of climate change and hazard scenarios, so that we can really combine those two types of science to take into account the hazards of tomorrow due to climate warming, and also all those questions regarding how to understand the risks of the cities of tomorrow, and how to let's say predict what will be the cities of tomorrow. How to also understand the relations between different hazards, say simultaneous or cumulative occurrence, but also the interrelation between different forms of vulnerabilities, social, economical, but vulnerabilities of population, interrelated with vulnerabilities of the infrastructures, for instance. I think there is also for us a question of how to tackle the issues of misinformation and disinformation. So before, we are talking a lot about the issue of acceptance of technologies and information by people on the ground. But now, with the spread of social media and also, like all those misinformation, disinformation trend, I think that's also another key issue for us that will be needed to tackle. There are also lots of debates currently and innovation related to what we call anticipatory actions, how to respond to an event before it actually happens, so how to predict, and how to start preparation and response. And lastly, how to apply all those and how to address all those challenges, and how to apply disruptive technologies without actually harming people, without exacerbating inequalities, which I think, of course, is going to be a big risk. So I think that's all from me. So again, I tried to get you a brief overview of really what lies ahead in terms of what we can do, the potential of digital public goods, and we are going to see today and discuss today many examples. So I hope we'll have a fruitful discussion. So thank you, everyone, and over to you as well.
Thank you, Pierre, for that overview. I'm sure we'll return to some of those challenges. It's stimulated some questions already for me. Over to Jenty to moderate the first session, which will focus on supporting interoperability and open access to disaster risk data and models. Jenty, do you want to open that session?
Thank you very much. I must admit, Stu, I wasn't expecting to be moderating this one. So perhaps, Pierre, you can just help me while I get a little bit oriented and jump in on this. I thought I was doing the next one. Perhaps, yeah, I mean, essentially what I'd love to do is just to introduce a great range of speakers here. We've got Adam from UNDRR, Nick Moody from the Risk Modeling Alliance, Tiziana from Epicenter UCL, Dickie Whitaker from OASIS. And essentially what we were looking at is really that issue of interoperability and open access, because it's clear that if we can get the basis right, we're in a very strong position to build the kinds of networks that we need. If I can, what I'd like to do is just, our format here was really to allow people just to give a little taster feel of the issues in their from their perspective, and then we were hoping that we can have a good discussion around some of those points. So if I may, what I'd like to do, first of all, is just hand over to my colleague, Adam Fysh, who will give a little bit of a feeling of where we are in terms of some of the definitions around DRR, some of the interoperability issues around terminology, and particularly around the hazard information profiles that were recently developed and which we think could be a good base in particularly in our DRR sector in getting the right framework for digital public goods. So Adam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jenty. Good afternoon, everybody. I apologize in advance. My dog has just seen something, so there may be a sudden bark in the to intervene here. I think this is really exciting, and I think that exactly as Jenty said, we have some specific examples of things that UNDRR has been working on with our partners to sort of build the interoperability and enhance the access that enhance access to those kinds of resources that help users to make those decisions that they need to make to find the resources they need to make those decisions. And it occurred to me while I was listening to Pierre at the beginning that, you know, as we increasingly realize that risk reduction is not simply the job of those disaster managers, it's really something that crosses sectors, that crosses scales of administration, it crosses from private to public and back. There's this importance in allowing the users to sort of dig into the details of the information and remix it to their own purposes. And I think that there's a real important spirit behind that. There are a few things that UNDRR has been working on. As Jenty said, probably the most punctual one related to interoperability is our work in supporting the hazard review and classification. Some of you may have participated in this or been part of this. This has been a very detailed deep dive into 302 highly discussed hazards in a detailed classification, and then an accompanying hazard information profile for each of them that really goes through in detail, exactly as on cue, goes through in detail the indicators, the owning institutions that sort of are the ones who are responsible for, all right, that's enough, for shepherding the hazard across communities, some of the literature that's related to it, some recent applications of it. These hazard information profiles and the hazard review and classification are available on Prevention Web and on UNDRR site, and thanks to the IRDR and ISC, among many, many communities of others. I think it's a really rich resource that allows people to sort of have a common basis of what do they mean when we talk about the risk of ash clouds or of desertification or of coral bleaching, or indeed some of those harder to understand ones that or maybe less commonly concerned ones related to space weather, for example, to really make sure that there is a sound common foundation. And soon we'll have the definitions. Thank you, Kenza, for putting the link into the chat there. And we will soon be starting to connect some of the hazard information profiles to UNDRR's work in terminology. You're probably familiar with the 2009 terminology on disaster risk reduction, the updated 2016 terminology. And we're currently sort of connecting the hazard work and the terminology and some of the glossaries and some of our other foundational documents, including the global assessment reports and others, into the understanding risk section of Prevention Web, try to make better use of that, again, in the public interest of making that available and as a common foundation of information. Maybe I'll stop there on cue. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Adam. And of course, I think many of you also know about some of the work that we're beginning under the Global Risk Assessment Framework, which is also about bringing together a number of the different risk resources available for different countries. And we hope this will be a good opportunity to organize that schematic around those key terminologies. But of course, as an aggregator of data, we're only as good as the quality of what's going into it. So we'd love to see this community, evolve so that we can make sure the best data is available. And on that note, I'd like to, if I may, hand the floor to Nick Moody, who is a colleague with the IDF, wearing many hats at the moment, but I think I'm hoping he can highlight some of the issues around helping countries get access to that next generation of modeling and some of the really interesting initiatives coming up through the Global Risk Modeling Alliance, because I think it really hits on being able to make products more usable where they're most needed. So Nick, the floor is yours.
That's great. Thanks very much, Jenty. I mean, first of all, actually, what I would just like to do is acknowledge the terrific work that's happened, that the UNDRR and GFDRR have put into this space for so many years now. And what I'm going to talk about now is just a little bit about how some of the efforts that are being made to support countries by bringing private sector capability also to this mix. And behind that, of course, there'll be also reference to a number of themes that we talked about already, including, for example, open source frameworks such as OASIS and open data standards. So for those who are not familiar with the Insurance Development Forum, on whose behalf I'm speaking, I guess it's an attempt to use Pierre's framework, Pierre's quadrant, as a reference point. It's an attempt to take that top right-hand corner of that quadrant and port that private sector, that reinsurance capability and risk management, risk understanding to development and humanitarian challenges. And a problem statement, I guess, that we've identified in the risk modeling group of the Insurance Development Forum is that the distribution of investment in risk understanding worldwide is clearly unequal. One could characterize maybe 80–90% of investment in risk analysis, and particularly the catastrophe risk modeling that we heard a little bit about earlier, and in the draft note, is in really 3 or 4 main perils of concern to the wealthiest nations on the planet. And we know that the greatest risks to human livelihoods, welfare, and indeed survival are elsewhere in the more vulnerable countries. So we think that needs addressing, and it's not just a question of equity or climate justice, although we've heard a lot of those themes in the last few days. But it's also, there are practical reasons why this is important. One of them is simply that hard decisions are being made that concern people's welfare in the most climate vulnerable countries without necessarily an understanding of the uncertainty or the assumptions behind the decisions. Another is that building a shared language of risk, particularly when it comes to risk metrics that can be applied to financial decisions for the movement of climate finance and so on, are absolutely critical to having an equal conversation between, for example, governments of vulnerable countries and international capital markets and providers of contingent risk finance. So there are plenty of barriers that have caused that inequality. Some are financial, as we've already heard. Some of them are contractual, relating to IP. There's the phrase is used, I think, in the draft paper around vendor locking, and what that causes is silos. And I think so many people on this call will already be very familiar with these things and will have worked in this area for a while. It causes a lack of common approaches. It causes countries to be locked into a particular source, a particular view of risk, to the exclusion of other views of risks. And as we all know, comparison of multiple views of risk is important to be able to build a more certain view of the risk situation. And ultimately what it causes is for hard decisions to be made based on somebody else's view of the risk, which just doesn't feel right. When it comes to public good modeling, we've concluded that a community approach is absolutely essential. So what that means is multiple providers, whether it's in academia, whether it's private sector, whether it's public sector. And I noted from the draft note again, there was an emphasis on that building of a community around risk understanding. So what's the solution? Well, we've concluded that the solution, or at least in some small way in which the private sector can help, is to partner with countries in a public-private partnership to develop local capability in finance-aware risk assessment. We put a label on a program around this, which is called the Global Risk Modeling Alliance. And we're delighted to see that actually there's a lot of demand in countries for this kind of approach. That was evidenced only 2 weeks ago with the signature of an agreement with the V20 group of finance ministers of countries, of the 55 countries of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, who were calling for exactly this sort of public-private partnership in risk and resilience analytics. So what's the connection here? Well, it's not a big leap to conclude that you need, in order to create these behaviors of sharing, to reduce uncertainty, you need open access platforms, you need common data standards, because what you're trying to do is encourage the behaviors where departments within a country are sharing and building a view of risk together. And not only that, but they're actually doing so not just with global resources and using other people's models, but they're actually developing a view of risk using their own local data and connecting universities, connecting research institutions and hydromet agencies and government research departments. And not only, for example, into the Ministry of Finance, but also disaster risk management agencies and so on. So within the IDF, a number of member companies have got behind this strategy and absolutely buy into these principles. And we have a number of strands going, which include building, if you like, an advocacy program, but also an operational program with countries. But there's also, if you like, a global strand to build infrastructure around this. And it wasn't a difficult decision to make, looking at a number of different open platforms, to advocate that OASIS should be an absolutely foundational in all of this, because it brings a number of different elements that are again referred to in the paper and indeed in Pierre's slides around not only if you like, a software foundation that is open access and everybody can use and understand, but also the open data standards that it curates, which are both, if you like, at the currently at the exposure data level, but also at the results level in terms of having a set of standards for the overall outputs of catastrophe risk models. So supporting that program for making infrastructure available to as widely as possible, and therefore accelerating the spread of risk understanding, there are a number of strands that group of companies through the IDF are investing in. One of them, for example, is making OASIS as usable as possible, not only for private sector organizations, because that is, after all, its genesis, but also for public sector organizations. And so there's money going into, for example, the development of an entry-level tool that means that talented people who may not necessarily be familiar with catastrophe risk modeling can nevertheless access these principles and manipulate data in using their own data in their own environments, and as Adam put it, mix it up for their own purposes. So there's that. There is, Stuart indeed is leading some very significant work, both on the interoperability side, and so transformation of formats within the world as it currently is, but also with OASIS, a large number of companies working, and indeed more broadly GFDRR as well, working on open data standards for the world as we want it to be in the future. There's a lot of other stuff going on. For example, there's also work on promoting much wider access to model metadata, so that countries, rather, I should say, are able to access information about the models and the data sets that go into them, who's used it, what they were built for, have they been validated, and all of that good stuff, because the information around the models and data is also very important. This speaks perhaps to one of the early points that Lucy mentioned around awareness. So what does this all make possible? It makes possible greater insight into uncertainty. It makes possible operational transactions, and this does speak to one of the advantages of OASIS, whether this is talking about investment in adaptation or contingent risk finance, or indeed humanitarian anticipatory action. If you have a platform like OASIS, then you are actually able to not only take a strategic view of your risk, but also execute operational transactions. It makes it possible for multiple departments and agencies to work together. It makes it possible to have choice. And by the way, that might include choosing to license and pay for your models and data. Not everything has to be free. In fact, it's highly desirable that some of it shouldn't be, because then you keep up a competitive environment in terms of innovation in this field. It makes possible the integration and sharing of local data. And also it makes it possible, and this is my last point, sustainability. If countries are able to use these tools and standards for developing their own view of risk, they can create value. And if necessary, if they wish to, that means they can charge for that value to those who can afford to bear that charge. So this is about mixing both public good and the ability to license and generate a sustainable future income. So those are just some thoughts, some things that we've been working on. I'm delighted to say that this program, the Global Risk Modeling Alliance, is getting a great deal of traction and support. And I imagine that quite a few of us on this call will be working together on it. So I'm looking forward to that. Jenty, many thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Nick. And so I think that we've heard that, in a sense, you know, the normative base is there. We've heard that the private sector is interested in working with the public sector, and that there are useful initiatives that are moving. I'd be very interested now to hear from Tiziana Rossetto from UCL, how the academic world fits into this, and whether or not this emerging, I wouldn't quite say consensus, but whether this emerging movement is also connecting well into academia, or if there are particular challenges in the innovative approaches that often come from the academic world that don't fit this model so well, or where they do fit this model so well, or where the action needs to really happen to use that UNDRR phrase, move words into action. So Tiziana, the floor is yours.
Hello, hi Jenty, thank you. Lots of questions. I'm not sure I can answer them all, but I'm going to put my spin on it. And I'm very thankful that Nick actually preceded me in today's discussion, because he's outlined a lot of the things I actually fully subscribe to, you know, the whole idea of capacity building within country for the collection of data and for the processing and development of risk models, and the idea of standards behind there in terms of interoperability. And, you know, in terms of supporting on interoperability, I know that there's quite a lot of good work going on around deriving standards and taxonomy regarding the different elements of risk, so hazard, vulnerability, which is the area that I work on specifically, and then just risk in general. And I just want to put to you some of the observations I have from working on a project on the Challenge Fund with GFDRR, trying to develop a vulnerability data schema, which looks at multiple hazards, multiple assets across different geographical scale, and tries to capture the information that is out there already on vulnerability and fragility. And in doing that, one of the things I want to say is that existing taxonomies, etc., are still not good enough. They are still centered on those sort of three hazards that have had all of that investment, essentially, when looking at risk understanding, and particularly earthquakes. And the others are left a little bit to one side. And that reflects both in taxonomies for vulnerability, but also for exposure, and therefore also damage data collection. And therefore there is a big variability in data, and this comes down to, and this is reflected then in the variability or uncertainty associated with the models, which is not just data, but is also based on process, on methodology used, on how they're developed. And I just want to bring in this idea of the reliability, which I think is sometimes missing in these conversations that we're having. We're talking about accessibility of data, but we're not talking about whether that data is good or bad. So, I'm a professor at UCL. I could basically draw a squiggly line on a piece of paper and sell it to you as a hazard curve or as a vulnerability function, and somebody would probably use it if it was made freely available, even though it maybe didn't have any documentation or didn't meet any particular standards. But is that really what we want? So I think, again, it's not the accessibility of it is not the only thing. It's also looking at proper documentation. It's looking at being able to, as a community, impose certain standards in terms of reliability and in terms of appropriateness. And that's something that needs to be developed as well, and alongside the normal taxonomy for classifying different things and for making sure that, you know, the hazard speaks to the vulnerability, speaks to the overall risk, and that one risk model speaks to another. And that's something that's slightly missing. It's sort of, the idea is there that some data is better than nothing. But I want to share with you a little outcome of a small expert elicitation we carried out recently with a student of mine, where we basically sent round a questionnaire to ask people about how they would select in this case it was a hazard model, but based on the following criteria: data availability, data quality, processing time, user skills, model performance, and software license. We actually got 16 responses from people in the CAT modeling industry with between 2 to 30 years of sort of experience in the field. And what was interesting is actually that the main criteria that they decided was at the basis of their selection of a particular model was data quality, followed then by performance, and only third came data availability. So I think if we put data quality and performance together, in essence, that talks to the point I was making about reliability. And I think that that's just an important thing, that actually it is how we choose our models as well, and needs to be there. And maybe there needs to be a standard for that, a standard for ranking or rating different risk models and different risk products, which is useful. And I think there is an opportunity, and with the Global Risk Modeling Alliance, I think that hopefully this will become reality, for actually empowering the local communities in different areas of the world to better collect data, to store data, and to disseminate that data appropriately, because without the core data, then everything else falls down. And I think there's an opportunity here to somehow insert those standards that are, you know, the good practice, and you know, put these in right at the fundamental level to sort of try and improve how, you know, the data on which we do then base our modeling, etc. I completely agree that it has to be a relationship that brings together academia, the stakeholders in country, NGOs, and the industry, because it is, you know, risk modeling is done across these sectors and is used for different purposes. And indeed also across the different disciplines, so the engineering, the hazards, the data science, and so on and so forth. So it really is, going back to something that Lucy Harris said right at the beginning, the development of this community of practice, and that this community of practice has more exacting standards on data that's collected, on data and how it's reported, on how it's shared, but also has more exacting standards on how we evaluate the validity or the reliability or the usefulness of different risk models and products. And so I think I'll leave it there. I'm not sure I've answered any of your questions, Jenty, sorry.
Oh, I think you've given us really, really very, very rich food for thought. And I very much appreciate you raising these issues of quality, not only accessibility. And I think you really, particularly as we move into a more extreme and uncertain climate future, I think your comments have really nailed some of the real challenges in moving forward. It's one thing to get people to open up and share. It's another thing to look at the quality of what is coming out of that. So just before I hand over to Dickie Whitaker, who I hope can give us a sense of, from his perspective, how close we are to really having this moving in this idea of a new OASIS platform, or what some of the opportunities and impediments might be there. I just want to give the speakers a wee heads up that I'd like to, before we end the session, just ask them at the end to come back with one action they'd really like to see come out in the next couple of years that would move this agenda forward. So please be thinking about that while Dickie comes in with a couple of comments, and then we'll open the floor, I think, to hear from other perspectives also in the room. Dickie, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I may, I know this was sort of frowned upon, but I've been doing a little picture while we've been talking. Didn't do it in advance, so there may be some weaknesses, but I wanted to use this as a hopefully an aid memoir to some of the challenges. Can you see that, I assume?
Beautiful.
Okay, so thank you. So I think I'm going to start with this problem. I mean, I've got here I started with the sort of twin opportunities that I think we're talking about here today, being interoperability on the left and data standards on the right. And I think that I view them slightly differently. They are slightly different, but they have while they have different roles to play, they achieve the same goals. And I think they tend to be an either or sort of opportunity. But I think without going into all of that, because we all know sort of the value that they provide, I think there are some opportunities, I think, that we've been trying to utilize. And I've got it here on the right-hand side of the screen with the role of the commercial marketplace. And then I think it has two strands to it. The first one is ultimately, we are not usually talking about challenges that only exist for humanitarian opportunities. We're talking about, at least when we're talking about understanding risk, we're talking about challenges that the world faces. So if we can harness the commercial and the industrial sector to play a role in helping the causes that we're all here for today, then actually you've just got a massive gearing mechanism that can be used to help achieve what we're trying to do. And I think Nick's already explained this. I don't want to go into more detail about that, but ultimately I think part of the genesis of the IDF is trying to do that, and indeed OASIS as well. And one of the key things, there's two things. The gearing mechanism is really important. And I think some people in Glasgow the last few weeks, some commentators, I should say, missed that as the importance of that. But one of the other things it does, apart from the gearing side, is create sustainability potentially. Because if you can harness standards and interoperability across sectors, you've got something there to help prime the system and to keep it going. And I think I've seen that in not only in the standard space, but in some work we've been doing in parts of the world like Bangladesh and the Philippines. I think it's important that we think about the form of these licenses. If you're going to have a mixed, if you like, mixed marketplace for some of these standards, it becomes very important. So often the so-called, copyleft licenses are really problematic because you can't embed them usually anyway in commercial enterprises. So that can mean that the gearing mechanism that I think has a powerful incentive where it can work is therefore potentially stopped by copyleft licenses. So we, for that reason, went for a much more permissive license. Oddly, though, open data sounds like a sort of universal good. In some cases, if there's no license at all, and I'm afraid to say some academic institutions around the world are terrible about this, they don't apply a license at all, which means that you are sometimes, you've got to be careful about using it because there could be a problem if you don't have a license. And it's not just because you say, well, actually, I'm not a commercial organization, it doesn't really matter. There could be embedded information in that data that has a license to it. And because there is no license on this, you're not protected, and that can create a problem. So, and we've been curating data sets from around the world from academics, and the number of them that don't have licenses is sort of shocking, because in many cases, it does mean you can't really use it. The duplication of effort problem, I think, is obvious. We all talk about it, but it still exists. And I think it's tied into this other sort of plum-colored one on the bottom here, which often is sort of apathy, and you could add sort of silos to another sort of element of that. Number of times I've talked to individuals or institutions that basically say, I just want to solve this problem my own way, the way I've always done it, because that's how I think makes sense. And if you sort of say, yes, but you could be much more, it'd be much more beneficial if you were to do it to a set of standards that already exist, or make it interoperable. I've often seen people sort of basically say, well, I can't be bothered because that means more work for me. And it's very sad, but I'm afraid it does happen. And I don't think we should shy away from sort of recognizing that sort of problem, which sort of maybe leads on to the whole incentives thing, because, you know, why would we be doing this? And you know, the people on this call are very experienced with moving in and out of international organizations, academic organizations, and commercial organizations. Each of them have different sort of incentive structures. And I think a bit more recognition about what they actually are. You know, I think actually, if you're going to have a meeting, I think it'd be great to actually stick these things on a board to say, just so we all know, these are sort of generic incentives that our silos sort of face, you know, and publication, citations, and some other things that apply in academia are obvious ones. Commercial markets have slightly different ones. Speed is often one for them too, for example. And I think we don't often recognize these things. And I, in my role, end up by trying to sort of broker these relationships and manage them. And, you know, I think I recognize them and I think I've got some experience, but I still find it very, very challenging. I think I want to talk a little bit about quickly about climate change, because
and just make sure you wrap up in the next minute or so, just so we have a time for a little bit of discussion. But please keep going.
Next minute, it's fine. So climate change is sort of the new frontier for all sorts of things, of course. And basically, what the reality of that is, there are almost no standards. So I think of all the places to operate, it's the one that's the hardest to do. Penultimate thing I think I'm going to say here is, well, trust, let's not forget that. I mean, I suppose you could bundle that with incentives. But I think there's an issue here about, let's not have great be the enemy of good. I mean, at the end of the day, we sometimes are better off saying, here is what you should do for new planning or building codes in this country. And you could have an argument endlessly about, is there a better way of doing it or a worse way of doing it? But actually, it would just be much better if somebody adopted something, even if there is a better way of doing it. And my last point, and I'll save you a bit more time, hopefully, by saying, what's my one wish for the end of this meeting or the future? It's to do this thing here about how to recruit others. So I think sometimes on these standards, I do this myself, and I do this with some people that I'm able to talk to, but who do we need to recruit to make these standards successful? And if we think that we know what that is, why don't we develop a plan that actually does that? But a plan across all of our organizations. And I think if we did that, we would achieve an awful lot in a short period of time. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that that's very, very, very useful and very sage. And I very much hope that you will share the beautiful slide with us, because I think it encapsulates many of the challenges that we face. Perhaps I'd love to hear from some participants, please. I think we've got some very rich points on the table, and I would just love to hear some reflections, perhaps from the floor, in the next few minutes. Please, I'm not seeing hands up in the current lineup, so I think perhaps feel free just to jump in or put a question into the chat. Or perhaps reflections from my GFDRR colleagues on some of the points raised.
Jenty, I have a couple of connected points. GFDRR some years ago, 8 years ago, produced a report assessing open risk tools in general, and provided some documentation around their origin, their purposes, etc. IDF has created a catalogue of industry or insurance industry risk models with some information around what they provide in terms of geographic and hazard coverage. And I wonder if there's a need for a kind of unified resource with information, as Tiziana mentioned, around the utility of those models, the kind of applications they're suitable for, the kind of scales applications they're not suitable for. And in doing that, wondering how the DPG Alliance can help and link up with people like OASIS, IDF to help build a better repository of this sort. So So yeah, just wondering if it's time to kind of reboot that assessment of open source risk tools and provide a unified library. Thanks.
I mean, I can tell you that for some of the things that we're doing under GRAPH, those sorts of resources, I mean, because we've been trying to do a little bit of some similar things independently, essentially beginning that road, and it would be great if there was a wider taxonomy there, I think. I'm seeing a question in the chat of, do the panelists think political institutions and politicians can be incentivized to change the way they act in supporting work in this area? I think perhaps based on an assumption, maybe there's not enough support here. And while the panelists are thinking about that, perhaps I see Rashmeen would like to come in. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jenty. And just want to kind of respond to Stu's question as well. As part of some of the work that I was actually working on disaster risk financing, as also in the Latin American and Caribbean region, yes, we did some work related to looking at openly available software, and we also did some other updates on that as well. So that work is kind of ongoing, and we can kind of expand it to some of the other regions as well. So that could be one thing. The second thing, coming more from a disaster risk practitioner from the field side, there's also this disconnect, and I think Tiziana kind of talked about this, between risk engineering, what's actually needed at the asset level, as opposed to kind of the catastrophe risk modeling that is actually more applicable at the portfolio level. You know, so and this is something we still haven't come to an agreement on how to actually move forward for the public sector. You know, I think there are certain different challenges for the private sector, but certainly for the public sector, we actually haven't come to some of the key solutions relating to that. And I think this particular group and the expertise would actually be able to help moving in that particular direction, especially when the countries also need to report on the SDGs as well. Thanks.
Thanks. I think those are very, very wise words, and I'm happy to hear what sounds like some interest in perhaps continuing discussions across these groups, because I think that it's absolutely essential, as a number of the speakers have said, that we begin to work across some of those silos. Otherwise, the efforts are just bound to be uneven and fragmented. I'm aware of the time, and I don't see new hands up. So what I'd like to do is just give each of the panelists just 30 seconds to either respond to one of the points in the chat or to give a sense of their particular action. I think Dickie already gave us a great one in terms of looking at the idea of a plan and a joint initiative, but perhaps I can hand over first to Adam for just 30 seconds of thought.
Thank you. So just turning my mic on again. Yeah, no, I think action is the question. I think that there are really, we will hear a lot of examples of strategies and policies and partnerships and so on. And I think the real question is how to bring this to an end user perspective, to bring this to relevance for a decision maker. I know, I mean, I guess, Jenty, you and I would promote the graph. We've been talking about the graph and this pillar one. So I think that it really comes down to asking decision makers what their needs are and then building from there, using that as a starting point, solve from X, over.
Perfect, very useful. So I think what you're saying is, yeah, let's look at that end user and see how this can align. Very, very helpful. Okay, Nick, over to you. 30 seconds.
Okay, so all right, then very quickly to Dickie, about who do we need to recruit, to the point about politicians and electoral cycles and so on. If ever there was a time when that were better than now, I don't know what it is, for appointing a country risk officer or a country chief risk officer. Now that might be a person, or it could equally well be virtual. It could be a group of, it could be a team across different departments and so on, but a group for whom, with whom rather, international organizations and organizations on this call can talk, and where we can build awareness of the principles we're talking about today and build demand and understanding, and therefore in countries have advocates for what it is we're trying to do here. I think that's absolutely key. So it speaks a little bit to Adam's point about end users as well. It's got to be demand driven, otherwise it's just not going to happen.
Thank you so much for that. Super useful. So Tiziana, the floor is yours.
I'm just excited by all of the activity on chat and how I've discovered the standards and things like that. And I think this is one of the issues. It's just we need to bridge that gap in knowledge between what is being developed out there and by different initiatives, essentially led by NGOs and industry, and what's happening in academia. And I hope that this forum actually put together today and maybe expanded somewhat can continue and can be the basis of further discussion, because it's only really together that we can improve things, make sure that we're not duplicating, which has been already said by several others. And yeah, I'm quite excited. So actually, I'm just hopeful that we keep going and that we start this conversation and continue this conversation beyond today in a way that aligns with different initiatives and we can help. And I think there is a big desire from academia to help and to understand, because that fuels our research, it fuels how we develop things and what we do. So yeah, and just call out, really, include us.
No, it sounds great. And just to really note, you know, from UNDRR side, we would love to see, you know, these discussions accelerate and connect, because it's utterly clear that if we don't make this an all of a society type initiative, it simply won't be oriented to the kinds of end users that we need to achieve Sendai Paris and the SDGs. So you can count on us in that. Dickie, I didn't want to shortchange you because you were so effective first time round. I don't know if there's a last final point you'd like us to take away from today.
I'll try and answer the question. So I think all governments, and in fact all donors, should only provide funds if they are being used to globally acceptable standards. They're one of the biggest incentive mechanisms we have. That's how they should use it.
Beautiful point, I think, to end this session on, because I think there is that incredibly frustrating situation where you see, you know, multiple money going multiple times for similar things that don't actually create the sort of sustainable resource we need. Okay, so colleagues, I think we've had an incredibly rich session. I won't even attempt to summarize this discussion, but I'm very excited to hear words like community of practice, continued discussion, excited, motivated, opportunities, demand-driven. So let's try and knit those together as we go on in the rest of this discussion. And Stuart and Pierre, can I let everyone take a brief break now? Or over to you guys to guide us on how to move forward in the rest of the day. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that was on the agenda. So let's have maybe a short 5 minutes break, and we will then close on second session.
Perfect. Thank you all so much, and particularly to the speakers today. I think it's been incredibly inspiring and useful. Have a great break.
Okay, are we ready to get started again after quite a short break? Adam, are you back with us?
I'm here. Change rooms, quieter room, hopefully.
I'm also avoiding a dog here. Do you want to get started with introducing session 2?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a good break. The second session about this, I don't know if you've referred to the paper, those participants who are here, but the second part, I guess, after talking about interoperability and access, the second part is sort of around fostering that innovation and making the tools available to those who are most vulnerable. So this is sort of a question of both capacity development and understanding users. We have a few interesting speakers here. I won't get in the way too much of this. I would like to challenge the non-speakers, the participants, to help me to think of or identify a few common patterns in these presentations or in these comments. One is around some principles that we can draw from these particular cases that might be applied more globally. And the second is, what is it that we mean when we are talking about the most vulnerable? This becomes a cliche in some cases. I don't mean that it will be a cliche in these examples, but it doesn't go without saying. So maybe if we can, I can challenge you to think about those two things in particular on top of your other obviously illuminated questions. I think that would be a very interesting way to summarize this later on. What are the principles we can draw and what do we mean by most vulnerable? I am pleased to start with my old friend, Justin. Justin, are you with us from IFRC to give us a little overview of the Global Risk Data Bank?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those of you in the East Coast of the US. Adam, do you mind if I just share my screen briefly? I'm going to take silence as a yes. Can everyone see my screen? Hopefully. I've got just a couple of slides.
I'm not sure I can make you up, but I think Pierre can.
Yeah, we can see your screen, Justin.
Okay, merci Pierre. Okay, so I'm going to dive right in and talk a little bit about something called the Global Crisis Data Bank. This is something that we at IFRC are working on already, but are basically relying on partners like yourselves to really make it grow and work effectively. In a nutshell, it's actually a very old idea. It's nothing really new. But basically, it's the following. We are bringing together information on hazards, so the obvious things like the hazard type, the location, intensities. And this is coming from a number of different partners, such as WMO, USGS, academia, et cetera. And then for every one of those hazard events, we are also collecting information on either modeled or observed impacts across a set of standard indicators, such as those that you see there on the left-hand side of the screen. And this comes from another range of partners, including the Red Cross, Red Crescent National Societies, but many, many others. And then finally, the third kind, which is really for an internal use case, is also information on responses, so that we can learn from past interventions, and so we can also promote peer-to-peer learning across the different Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies. And we have a number of different internal use cases and applications for this crisis data bank, but one of them, or some of them, have to do with risk modeling and the use of risk information, which is what I'll just cover on the next couple of slides. So this is a schematic diagram of the system that we're in the process of building, and which is publicly available on something called the Go Risk module here at IFRC. And you can see on the left, just at a glance, a number of the different partners who are part of this initiative. And we're bringing in information from probabilistic risk models, which you can see on the left, and then using those model frameworks to generate impact forecasts for specific hazard events, which is something of huge interest to our national societies. And we're basically bringing this information together as follows. what you see is you get a map. When you hover over a specific hazard icon, you get the footprint for it, either forecast or observed if it's an earthquake. And then when you click on it, you get the impact forecast data. So the absolute values there on the left, and then a indicated return period for that impact shown on the right. And we have a number of different partners providing these impact forecasts, including some from the Red Cross and Red Crescent National Societies themselves, such as the Netherlands Red Cross's 510 initiative, but also from academia, from ETH here in Switzerland, the Pacific Disaster Center, and many others. And basically, the idea here, and speaking to a point that was made earlier, is we're essentially curating a number of models because we don't have a stake in any of them. And what we're trying to do is essentially run a contest to see which ones have the best track record for a given hazard or for a given geography, or to put it a different way, what is the skill of the forecasts or the biases in the models, so that we can allow our decision makers to compare them very transparently and to track the progress in the model development over time. And this is something that we didn't invent. This comes as an approach from the public health sector, which has been doing this now for several years with influenza forecasting. And then the second kind of information that we're visualizing is more seasonal or country month units of measurement information, so that every one of the national societies or IFRC regional offices can see at a glance, as they move the slider there across the x-axis calendar, what the risks are within every given country, within every given month, by hazard, and then by specific kind of risk. And there are a number of follow-up points I'd like to make regarding things that Tiziana mentioned and others, but in the interest of time, I'll save that for later. And I think that will just close for the moment and turn it back to you, Adam.
It's really tough to be so fast in these kinds of things, isn't it? That was excellent, Justin. Thank you very much. I was trying to take notes on one of your slides and it went past too quickly, unfortunately. Thank you very much. I would like to then ask Anders Pedersen, I think is the next one, from the World Resource Institute, to join next. I think I saw your name on there. Are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Over to
So
you.
I wanted to ask, would I be able to do a screen share as well?
Yes, yeah, you can, Anders.
Okay.
So yeah.
Great. So let me just start by saying a little bit about our work, and then what I'll do is I'll demo just a couple of data sets that might be interesting to us. So World Resources Institute we have now more than 10 years of experience in building various platforms for the environment. Some of you may know the platforms we've built for forestry, Global Forest Watch, or for water stress, Aqueduct. But more recently, we really started to look at climate risk and what can be done about it. In 2016, we launched the PrEP platform, the Preparedness and Resilience Initiative, which really tried to hone in on how can users look at long-term risk forecasting in a way that's intuitive, that's accessible on the web. Because many of us will know that all of these models that are looking at 30 and 50-year forecast, it can be very difficult to comprehend at a regional, at a community level, what that actually means. So what we've thought a lot about at WRI is how do we make this visually tangible? How do we make it accessible? And how do we take some of all of that open data that's available and make it useful for communities? And I would say, like in our approach, so more recently, we've received a grant from Walmart Foundation to dive in and do more focused climate risk, to do a tool that's focused on agriculture and climate risk planning in the longer term. And when we've looked at that, we focused on a couple of things in terms of how to think about engaging vulnerable communities and making sure that it's that the tool is accessible. I think the first thing that we're thinking about is it's really important to understand what role intermediaries can play in using tools and platforms that we're developing. So if we talk about benefiting farmers, for example, who will be exposed to climate risks, to temperature change, who may need to change the crop that they're growing, who may need to switch sector entirely out of agriculture, it's really important to understand what community groups, what national organizations, what farmer cooperatives can help relay that information to users. So I think understanding by understanding and engaging with intermediaries, we can get a better understanding of how does information actually trickle through to the ultimate end users who will have to benefit. So that's one. The other thing that we're thinking hard about is how to actually do robust, responsible data use and data ethic assessments on the project. So we want to make sure that the tool we're building is not one that will just benefit a few companies who can then maybe better plan where they want to divest, because there are real divestment risks in the climate resilience space. If you just provide data that can improve allocations for companies then who are not interested in investing in climate resilience, you may actually end up with a net negative where companies will pull out of countries and supply chains faster than we had anticipated instead of investing with communities. So understanding the data ethics is the second piece. And then the third piece that we're really investing in, we're doing this project over 15 months as sort of a first prototype stage, is really to build with communities rather than building for communities. And the way to do that, the way our conclusion in our product development has been, we're really engaging stakeholders from the very early on, and then we're developing the tools with communities. So we are meeting the community groups and stakeholders. We're focusing for now in Colombia and India. They will be meeting with our web developers in actually developing the tool. So like just very concretely making sure that communities are represented in the same room. So maybe just quickly, I know I shouldn't spend much more time, but I'll just quickly try and share some examples of some of the data that we're working on. And so I wanted to ask, do you guys see my screen?
We see it.
Great. So so this is an example. So ResourceWatch is WRI's cross-institutional data platform. That's the platform I lead. We've recently added downscale projections of next GDP to ResourceWatch. That includes a number of different scenarios. It includes opportunities to scroll from all the way in decades, all the way out to 2080. And then it includes, if you're familiar with next GDP, all the different indicators that you have there, from precipitation, extreme heat days, really a big variety of data. Now that can then be overlaid with some of your agricultural data, right? So it's not enough in itself. You need to have a credible forecast also of like what will be grown in different areas. So another great data set that we're expecting a lot from is World Resources Institute launched the Land and Carbon Lab at COP just last week. And a data set, do you see, I changed this? Yeah. So long story short, that data, the sort of one of our signatory data sets that we developed for this with University of Maryland is a 30-meter resolution land cover data set that included all classes. So you'll maybe know University of Maryland for their signatory data set on Global Forest Watch that focused on forests. But what's exciting now is that we'll start to get data on other land classes. And there's a reason why the other land classes are coming later. It's because it's much more difficult to identify what's scrub, what's agriculture, what's bare ground. And I'm just zoomed in on these. This is tracking from 2000 to 2019. And what's really interesting is we can see a lot of the cropland gains we can see where cropland is expanding, and we'll also be able then to overlay and analyze how that relates to some of the risks around war. I'll stop here, but I just wanted to give a flavor of some of the work that we're doing specifically on the data.
Super interesting and super exciting, Anders. Thank you very much. I'm really glad that you brought up the issues of intermediaries, of ethics in particular, which is a massive one that we haven't really discussed much, and the co-design approach. Thank you very much. SM Mehdi Hassan, please. I saw your camera on a moment ago. Are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, please. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. So, can you see my screen? Excellent. Thank you. So, let me introduce myself. I'm Mehdi Hassan. I'm working as a consultant at the disaster risk management team at the World Bank Office, Dhaka. And today I'm going to talk about a geospatial data sharing platform that, which is completely open source and has been in operation for quite a few years. So Geodash is a open source based geographic information system sharing platform. So it can be used to share, upload, share GIS data. So what Geodash offers is an opportunity for interoperability between different standards and the maps that are here or maps that can be prepared here can be shared very easily. And it also offers the ability to import any GIS layers, and those can be used to create maps from here. So the important thing here is that usually GIS softwares are quite complicated, and using those requires some basic understanding of the geospatial data system and basics of GIS. But what Geodash offers is an opportunity to use GIS-based data and the utilization of those without any prior experience of GIS. So these are some of the main features of the system that it offers. So the thing is that the main thing is that the data can be uploaded any form of GIS data, which can later be used for building maps. So here you can see on the system architecture how Geodash was developed. So which is all open source. It was developed entirely on open source based platforms and tools.
Maybe, sorry to interrupt you. I'm not sure we can see. We still see the first slide. So maybe it's because you.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Let me.
Yeah.
Let me reshare them.
Okay, so we can see your screen, but it's not on presentation mode. So maybe.
Sorry about the technical issue.
That's all right.
Eddie, do you think you can sort of just talk us through it without the slide?
Yes, yes, definitely. So the cool thing is that now Geodash is a completely open platform that can be used by anyone, and it can be it offers a wide range of services. So the core objective was to develop a platform that could be used by anyone, and it could work as a platform so agencies can share their data, different organizations, and everyone can actually get access to see what other organizations have. Sorry, I just shared it in. Is it viewable now?
Yeah, we see now on the overview of Geodash.
All right. Sorry about the issue earlier. So here, this is the homepage of Geodash, which shows also a summary of how many organizations are currently using it, how many data are currently in Geodash, how many users are there. So which shows that there is quite a number of organizations already using this platform. And this is also there are lots quite diverse. There are organizations like World Bank and there are government organizations. There are other private sector organizations. Now, this is an overview of how it was developed in the beginning. So it was part of a tool assistance that came in 2014 initiative from GFDRR, and it took about 3 years to take the plan to fruition. Now, a brief summary of the features actually, as I was also mentioning earlier, that it supports uploading any geospatial data, which is also vector or raster, both is supported, and this list can be utilized for creating maps, and this list can also be visible, and the attribute tables are also accessible from the platform. And so as such, it offers the opportunity for our organization to share each other's data so other organizations can get a sense of what the other organizations have, so which could reduce the paperwork or which could reduce the time to search for data between organizations. So let's dive into the platform. So this is the main navigation panel of the system. So there are layers and maps and documents which can all be exported, and it does not even require any opening any accounts, but it can be accessed by anyone. And to open an account, it can be done by anyone, and anyone who has an account can upload a GIS data set. And in addition to GIS data, other kind of data are also available. And this is a short view of the layers that are available, interfaces, and the maps that are available, which shows that it also offers a thumbnail view, which is quite useful. This is an interface of how the data can be visualized in the system. So there are quite a number of base map options available. The basic or the default one is the OpenStreetMap. So any GIS data that are uploaded that is not faulty can be viewed in Geodash. So there is a great benefit that anyone who actually doesn't have any GIS experience or doesn't have access to GIS software can actually use this to visualize any GIS data. And these data can be stored here, and data can be downloaded here. Now the uploaded data can obviously, there are certain privacy options. Download can be restricted, or people who wants other people's data that are restricted, they can put a request for downloading the data. So these are some of the key features there provided by the data uploading there. Now, further to the next features, these data layers can be used and combined to create maps. There quite few different layers have been combined, and now this can be prepared into a map. And in addition to just combining layers, it offers some other features like the color themes or the legends can be changed, and some other calculations, measurements. These kind of features are available within the system, which can be used, which is quite useful. And now a little about the system, how it functions. So the system is being maintained by Bangladesh Computer Council. After the development, it was handed over to the government, and Bangladesh Computer Council is the responsible organizations. They are operating the system, and they are maintaining the system from their side. And any organization they want to register Geodash as an organization need to get their approval. And their organizations, they have to have their own managers, and then they can have their users. So this is a little about how the kind of organizations that are already using the system, and how the organizational view, or what are the features that organizational view are offered in the system. So the organization have any organization that it can be explored unless it's private, and what kind of data they have, or how many members they have. This is visible unless they're restricted. So this is how the internal system organization view is. So the members can be visible, and in the organizational structure, any member can actually upload data, but the publishing actually requires manager approval, which has been kept, so the data quality can be maintained. So this is in summary the introduction to the system, and it has been used by a number of organizations as I mentioned earlier, and to the use there has been a certain number of use cases, and organizations are using this, and many organizations have hosted quite a number of data here, and many other organizations have had access to this data, and they have been able to utilize this data for different kind of analysis and different kind of dimensions of different planning purposes. So in summary, this is the overview and use cases of Geodash that is so far I have been there. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Mehdi. I think this is a super interesting one. I love meetings like this where everybody presents these things, because I end up taking down all of the URLs and I write down and go and explore these systems themselves. And I think this showed a great example of some of the local use cases with the city corporations. Excellent stuff. Thank you very much. I'll pass quickly now to Pedro Gonzalez, please. Are you with us? I think I saw you there. Yeah, there you are. And Teradue.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Adam. I hope you see my screen. I'm trying to put this on presenter mode. Still seeing it? Yes.
Yeah, fine
Okay.
now.
So thank you very much. Pedro Gonzalez from Teradue. I'm trying to present you something now about cloud-based services for using free and satellite data. And we've been, Teradue is a member of the global, we are a small SME based in Italy, and we are a member of the Global Development Assistant, Agile Information Development, Disaster Resilience Consortium between ESA, the European Space Agency, and the EFIs. And now experience in this domain is really for the past 5 years, we're focusing on the GeoAsset exploitation platform and also on the disaster charter mapper that we are doing it in collaboration with ESA. So for the last 5 years, we've seen that the GeoAssets tab is available for the community with a wide range of of services, and lots of users. We are 2,500 more users from 150 countries, 130 organizations are really requesting and having the need of having processing services for satellite data and extracting the information that they need for their cases. In another scenario, we have also the disaster charter mapper that is available in operations only for the disaster response context and for the members of the disaster charter, and it's restricted users from those agencies, from 15 agencies, covering lots of EU missions, 40 more EU missions, and we see the value and develop the tools to really support the usage of the Earth observation and satellite imagery. We've seen that Copernicus Sentinels and Landsat really changed the way that the satellite data can be used. You have large volumes of data, free data, and a long-term commitment for having that available. And this really changed the perceptions in terms of the investment needed and what is the entry level to access this data. And if we join this with the possibility nowadays with low-cost processing services from the cloud, we really have a world of opportunities here for the DRM purposes. And based on this, based on the developments we are doing on those projects, we are making available together in the Earth observation domain a service, part of our ELE platform, that provides generic space and tools for storing imagery and having open and free data. So places where you have access to open and free data, auxiliary data sets layers in a cost-effective way, so that you use for a specific case, for a specific response, for a specific disaster response, you use data. And here is really having a way to set up open data hosting for exploration, for data exploration. Here is a dedicated storage with process-ready data, where you have the totality of the Copernicus Sentinel images. Additional collections can be plugged in. auxiliary layers, even the OpenStreetMaps or the world population from the DLR of the NASA GMP, and most importantly, then trying to have this perception of the a set of basic service from to do EO data processing, be just visualization, be band combination, change detection when you have floods, specific mappings, and the important point is the opportunity for the communities to host their data, their open and free data, and then adding more data as they have in a specific case response, and to provide the possibility to automatically ingest the data, organize the data through known standards and quite adopted nowadays like STAC, the Spatial Temporal Asset Catalog, or the cloud optimized geotips. So in simple open source tools that people can host their data and have then processing services on top of it to really apply it to a specific situation. I will show you just, and I'm not taking too long here explaining the technical details, but I will show just a few examples of activities we've been doing, or in the context of the geohazards, or in the context also of the charter, of the disaster charter. And you have, then you apply this, you define a data hosting service, you define a set of data for responding to volcano eruptions. You get all this data together, you collocate all this data, all those services, and then the community comes in and is able to process and extract that information themselves. So they are able to create those value products, those decision-ready information needed. Here in this case is mapping a large flood. So having this way of collocating a large amount of Sentinel-1 data, radar data, and having the tools then for that community, for a specific community that they want to analyze the temporal series, you are able to extract that information that then you pass to a different level, to a decision making. Here is just an example of a RGB in terms of the land use change. Another case here was in the dam break in Laos in 2018, and here is it. You set up a data hosting solution, you have that data with open source catalog tools and open source processing services, and you are able to extract that information here. Here in this also the case of fire. So I'm just showing different concepts in sense of that the community then arrives to that place and is able to extract that information. In this case, mapping wildfires. So to conclude here, the idea and the takeaway message here is that we have the possibility to really have a dedicated storage for process-ready data with open source tools, collocated with open source tools, documentation, infrastructure, to really help the DRM community. By default, we have seamless access to the totality of the Copernicus Sentinel data and other free and open data and other data that the community wants to host in that place. We are at the moment seeking champions, users to validate this approach, to expand the service offering and to understand what are the needs that the community needs. Even if we are applying this to different, more focus on the geohazards, might other cases also useful to target. We are ready to support, and there are availability for sponsored resources, so the storage, the CPU, and so on, from the European space agencies. So we are ready to support those champion users into applying to having this type of resources sponsored by the ESA and the ESA Network of Resources initiative. So please don't hesitate to contact me, and we can discuss this further as the meeting goes. Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you all.
Thank you, Pedro. This is very, very interesting. I really appreciate the emphasis on the long-term commitment that sort of represents a change in the kind of investment that the owners of the means of doing these kinds of analysis they've changed the way they approach this, and that changes the access, that changes the availability for those end users that we're talking about. I think that's fascinating. The other one I think I really appreciate is the emphasis on the ESA disaster charter. This is something that, in a way, we're sort of talking about a charter. No, we're talking about principles for how disaster management data should be, what we think should be the sort of principles of data related to disaster risk reduction and disaster management, how it should be. And I think that is an interesting way of, some of this road has been paved. We have the DPGA who's joined us. So I think we can draw inspiration. Thank you very much for this. A reminder to everybody else, please do put some questions into the chat unless you would like to ask them directly in person. The last presenter I'd like to welcome is Marie Chalens from UNEP. I think you're going to be speaking to us about this Strata project. Is that right?
Exactly. Thank you, Adam, and thank you to all the previous speakers. I'll be very short about our tool, though, because I think I've heard so many interesting things already, and I would love to go on to the discussion and hear also what participants in the workshop have to say. So just shortly, I'll introduce myself. So I'm a climate security analyst at the UN Environment Program, and there I'm coordinating this data platform called Strata. And Strata is an easy to use online mapping tool designed to identify climate security hotspots. So it's a little bit of a different or like a niche within the disaster risk reduction field, I would say. And we try to answer three main questions. So first of all, where are climate stresses and environmental stresses converging, and how can we visualize that where those are converging? Then also kind of overlay that with information about conflict events that are happening. So really this peace and security angle that we have to it, and then overlay that also with the more well-known like socioeconomic risks, like data on vulnerability and exposure of the communities that are being faced with both climate and environmental hazards, but also with human-induced disasters of conflict. And so the goal of our platform is really to make this kind of analytical capacity, not only just visualizing, but really making this analytical capacity of merging all that information together available to practitioners on the ground who don't have any technical know-how on beforehand. So we specifically focus on this conflict affected and fragile regions. That's in our field, the people that we identify as most vulnerable. And so we focus also more on these man-made disasters, let's say. And so examples of how this tool is supposed to support practitioners on the ground is through through supporting their design, monitoring, and evaluation of interventions with really data-driven evidence of openly accessible data, of course, that we have in our platform, but also for awareness raising and campaigning, providing them the data to actually support that, but also in-depth assessments if they need to make baseline reports before starting intervention, or if there's information needed to prioritize action and funding in certain regions. And I just want to mention a couple of the main reasons why we started this project. So probably all know about cascading impacts and the interlinked threats between different disasters, but so also between climate change and conflicts and security threats. And we have a lot of data openly available, but the challenge has really been to use that in an accessible way for these practitioners on the ground. And to really, actually there are no tools available that support that kind of data analysis. There are some that do visualization, not specifically in this niche, so you would need to go to different platforms to actually get all the information that you need for this specific topic. But so we're trying to really bring that kind of analytical capacity to the practitioners on the ground in this climate security field. And so our timeline now is that we're finalizing our pilot version for Somalia by the end of this year, and we'll be launching it early next year. And yes, I'll keep the rest of the time for discussions. I'm happy to give demos of the platform we have. If anybody's interested, just reach out to me. I'll put my email address in the chat.
Thank you, Marie. I note also Jenty has just made a comment in the chat asking for links to this work, and I would second that. I think we've already seen so many things that I would like to revisit. So if you can put links to fact sheets or websites or anything from your work, or even for non-presenters, if you'd like to, please feel free to do so. Thank you, Marie. I think this was a fascinating one, and I think that more than we've heard in any of the other presentations, you've really started to talk about how you are validating the use by those communities that you're intending to serve. I think that really is something that we could stand to keep front of mind in a lot of ways. I think that's a really valuable way of approaching things. I wonder, are there any questions in the, let me just open the participant list here so I can see you all. Any questions for any of the panelists? You can either raise your hand or just start shouting, please. Jenty, you have one. Sorry, I just lost your question. Do you want to come in?
Sure. No, I think the presentations were fabulous and extremely exciting. And I'd just be interested to hear from Maria or others about what are some of the challenges that they may be facing in terms of interoperability or standards or data accessibility. And if there are things that this wider community might be able to do that would help you accelerate your work and innovate further. You know, if what would make your lives easier in helping you move quicker? Thanks.
Should I have a go, Adam?
Yeah, please go ahead, Marie.
Yeah, so interoperability, it's key for us. It's very important because this platform, like, we can make it just by ourselves and try to communicate it well, but the use of it will be most useful if we can actually integrate it into let's say like websites of country offices or of organizations that are actually working on the ground with peace building or with environmental issues in conflict affected areas. So that's really key for us. Also internally in UNEP, we have so many different platforms on different issues of environmental problems, pollution problems, climate problems, and they're often building on the same data. So there is this need and there is this push within UNEP to actually really start building it more interoperable. And first of all, we're doing that through kind of gathering all our platforms and making a catalog of everything we have. And then from there, start to think about, okay, let's create like a decentralized systems with APIs that connects everything. But on the long term, we would love to go to a more also centralized, like, data cluster, data bank, however we want to call it, like the humanitarian data exchange has on more humanitarian data, but then also for environmental data, and make those interoperable as well. And I think the higher level UN has a big role to play in that. And maybe it's kind of like, these are discussions that I hear in the hallways, in the virtual hallways, but I haven't seen any documents on it. Like, for example, on using like Microsoft Azure and creating data platforms on that UN-wide. So there is a lot of talk about this, but to be fair, the biggest challenge for me is that there is a lot going on, and like, I don't always know where to look for standards or how to push those. Also, when we are contracting implementing partners, so like maybe if UNDRR could kind of guide work in that would be very helpful. And I think that that's enough from my side. I see Anders has his hand up as well.
Very interesting. And I think the challenges are, you can see the direction of travel. Huh? We saw it in Pedro's presentation as well. You can see that this integration is coming, the access is coming, the availability, the tools is changing, but it is a question of really a bit of coordination at this point. Anders, please. And then Justin.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe just to build a little bit on the good points that Marie brought up. I think there's a real challenge in what we've noticed, and we did a quite comprehensive tools assessment as part of our research. And there are a lot of platforms being built that are either building within a space of massive data gaps or building on the same data sets that we're all using. And to us, that a result of that is, or a sign that is really a sign that we are seeing too few investments in infrastructure. In the pieces we're talking about, core interoperability, long-term investments in maintaining data sets and creating trusted, credible indicators that can be produced year in and year out. And we're seeing, I think, too much investments in platforms that are spun up that last for a year or two and then go away. And so I think there is a task for the community and for donors to a little bit get rid of their symptom of looking for the new shiny thing and actually thinking about the data infrastructure, because we won't really move forward if everyone just spins up new platforms using the same data featuring the same data gaps.
And there's excellent. And once again, you've raised one of the themes that we haven't really discussed yet, which is the role of donorship and finance in supporting this. I think this is a really big, not a blind spot, but it's something that we will ignore at our own peril. Justin, please.
Sure, thanks, Adam. Just 4 challenges I would just highlight very briefly and quickly. One relates to a point that Tiziana raised in the chat, which is simply the consumer side of this, and the lack of sophistication among many of our users in terms of just simply using risk metrics, interpreting them, or any of the outputs of a model, and anything related to uncertainty or model skill. So we have a whole suite of activities that we're planning to address that, some in collaboration with UNDRR and OCHA. A second challenge has to do with the alignment of the indicators. In order for what we're trying to do to work, we need to have really common definitions and standards for the predictions and for the observations to feedback to the modeling teams. If those are not aligned, then validation becomes that much more difficult. A third challenge has to do with just something that Andres just mentioned, which is the investment in infrastructure. So if the databases have hundreds of thousands to millions of events per year, and that accumulates over time, and we hindcast back into time, your database gets pretty big pretty quickly. And it's something that IFRC probably shouldn't be bearing the cost of alone. And it's probably not even appropriate for IFRC, honestly, to be bearing the cost of that alone when it is, a public good. And then lastly, I would just mention, kind of really related to a previous point, is just the validation data and the accessibility of it. So matching events to impacts, especially for historical events, and then making sure that the validation data is indeed reliable. It's not always the case. And therefore, we often need to rely on proxies or inferential analysis, et cetera, et cetera. I can go on for quite some time there, but I'll stop. But those are just 4 challenges to respond to Genty's question. Over. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Thanks for answering exactly the question. I know that WMO and UNDRR are doing a little bit of work on validation on, as you're aware of this as well. Thank you very much. I know we are needing to transition quickly to the next session. I must thank all 5 of you for your contributions and your inputs. Thank you very much. Thank you for the excellent questions in the chat as well. I therefore turn over, I think, to Pierre for the last session, please.
Yeah, thank you, Adam, and thanks everyone. It was really an interesting conversation. So I'm going to moderate the latest session that's going to be on communities and, let's say, local stakeholders, and how we can not only have this top-down approach of great tools, but also work with local stakeholders through maybe communities or partnerships to make sure that those technologies, those information are actually used, but not only used, but co-produced and also informed by the direct beneficiaries. And so for that, we have a great panel today. And first, I'd like to invite Eric Hubbard from the Municipality of Freetown in Sierra Leone. And Eric has been working on that tree planting campaign using digital technologies. I know he's been also involved with many other projects related to climate and disaster risk management. So Eric, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to, my plan was to talk about our Freetown to Treetown campaign. But based on everything that I've been hearing, I think it's important to step back a bit before we came up with our adaptation approach. We needed to deeply understand the drivers, to understand the problem that's associated with intense deforestation and the impact that it has on our city and on our residents within the context of exposure and vulnerability. And so I've decided to change my whole presentation and to focus a bit more around what those drivers look like and sort of the data that is required and how we access some of that data through sort of digital public goods, and how we use sort of open source software and processes like ODK and the like to actually collect the data so that we can understand the dynamics that actually then inform sort of, say for instance, where we plant trees to address particular problems. Is it possible for me to share my screen quickly?
Yeah, please, you should be able now.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. All right. So can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. So this is a sense of what some of our core climate drivers are. The essence by which through our city plan, our Transform Freetown plan, the mayor and the city council set a goal, a target of decreasing or increasing tree and vegetation cover by 50% in the city by 2022, which is quite ambitious. To address sort of the intense deforestation, or the impacts of it, the landslides, the flooding, the coastal erosion, sea level rise, extreme heat, loss of biodiversity and habitat, and the loss of water capacity in reservoirs that's creating a consistent water shortage and threat to our water supply. The way that we look at this is our equation around climate risk is climate change times hazard times vulnerability over capacity. And so what we seek to do is increase the capacity of communities to become resilient to climate-induced hazard. And we focus not necessarily, well, on both. We look at sort of the context for exposure, but within the context of all of those dynamics, all 1.5 million residents of the city are exposed, but there are those that are much more vulnerable. And so we have tailored and sort of structured our dynamics through a process of co-design with those communities, all communities, but particularly the most vulnerable. And when we look at the most vulnerable, we look specifically at the 35% of our population that live in informal settlements and live in the high hills and along the coast that are exposed sort of are the most vulnerable to the climate-induced hazards that cause the greatest level of problem. So before we could begin to address the problem, we needed to frame it. We needed to build risk profiles. And so the risk profiling dynamic becomes a critical component of how we sort of move forward and make our decisions. And so what I wanted to kind of share a bit kind of how we've done that and how we've designed it. There's been a lot of discussion regarding the end users and what we need and what is needed from us in order to create tools that can be used sustainably and effectively. And so within the context of our dynamics, we try to look at sort of the impact dynamics of the hazards that are the greatest challenge to our residents and to our economic dynamics in the city. So we look at it from the context around economic capital, social capital, and natural capital. And we first also then look at the various sectors that are affected within the context of all of the, by those particular hazards that cause extreme damage and that are creating a context.
Eric, we lost you. I fully. Okay, is that just me? Can you confirm?
It's not just you here.
Okay, trying to, okay, so let's see. It's a shame. Yeah, global connectivity issues. Okay, maybe Eric, you can, yeah. Oh, you're mute. So you're back, but you're mute.
Sorry about that.
Okay, go ahead. Maybe you can switch off your camera just to make sure, yeah, you don't lose your voice. And yeah. Excellent.
Okay. All right. So the context here is understanding the sectoral dynamics, but really understanding the geography of risk and how that geography of risk sort of affects the residents, and particularly those who are most vulnerable, and then sort of what kind of impact it has on the various sectors. And so we then look at sort of a rationale for inclusion of particular sectors, why those are actually important. And we go through sort of significant detail of then looking at the context of the hazard sort of against that particular sector within the context of the way that we've organized it in the by looking at the natural, the economic, and the social. So for instance, when we look at flooding, which is a massive problem for us, we look at it sort of in terms of how it affects all of these various sectors, from the social, from the natural, from the economic, so that we can then look at particular initiatives. So if we're now looking at sort of tree planting, the 1 million tree campaign that we have is designed to actually address sort of the problems that are associated with sort of problems that are encountered by these hazards, or sort of from these hazards by our residents, but also that affect critical and key infrastructure and sort of the economic dynamics sort of within the city. So we look kind of fairly deeply at the impact dynamics across the sector, across the capital, whether social, natural, or economic, and then group that by the specific hazard. And we then move this into a co-managed, a co-designed and then co-managed process of addressing the problem, critically in terms of the adaptation dynamics that are required to take us forward to become climate resilient. So as you can see, we look at sort of who's affected, we look at the facilities, we look at the level of loss, sort of whether it's buildings and overall economic loss, and we look at that sort of by sort of key hazard. And then
Eric,
what we
yeah, just we can't see your screen, so if you can try to reshare again. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't want it to interrupt you, but
no, sorry about that. Okay, I'll just keep talking. So the context, so the context then is specifically around this issue of how we, it goes back to the idea of, there we go. Can you see my screen?
Perfect, yes.
Okay, so it goes to the idea around how we actually determine sort of what these responses are. And gaining access to the data is critical in terms of how we do that, and then linking that back to communities in a process of saying, okay, this is what we understand it to be. How does it actually affect this particular community? And so we build sort of risk models that actually include particularly the most vulnerable communities, and understand then if we're talking about flooding, if we're talking about landslides, if we're talking about sort of water shortages or sort of coastal erosion or sea level rise, then how is it directly affecting those communities? And if we're talking about, say, sea level rise across the coastal areas, our focus then is on restoring mangroves in those particular areas that will sort of manage the context around flooding in those areas, but it will also then replenish fishing stocks and create a context for sort of greater economic vibrance, sort of as we move into an adaptive dynamic. So we try to look at all of those dynamics, and we take the data and we think from all of what I've been hearing, the way in which we are looking at it, sort of we must focus on sort of the number of people and facilities, sort of, and the types of damage, sort of the types of land use dynamics that are actually affected the most. But gathering that data is not always an easy thing. Our biggest data source came from the Think Hazard data that produced the multi-city hazards report for the governments of Sierra Leone that included Freetown and the other major cities. That data has been the data that has helped us to actually frame and understand all of these dynamics and then move them into a risk mapping dynamic in conjunction with a number of civil society organizations that we work through to reach communities on a rolling basis. So the document that we're looking at now is our latest. We do this basically every year. It was disaster risk mapping, it's now shifted into climate risk mapping. So we have folded in sort of the disaster risk dynamic and linked it and mainstreamed climate into that process. And all of these elements will then fold into what we are building now, our climate action plan. And so all of the elements, and for instance, the project that I lead, or the campaign, the Freetown to Treetown campaign to plant and grow 1 million trees across the Western area and particularly across the city, is designed to address some of these very specific risks. I wanted to focus on that first, but it seemed more important to talk about how we actually sort of collect, analyze sort of this particular data. We use public good dynamics around sort of software and processes and actual data and platforms that we actually use in order to do this. But the idea that sort of there's so much of it, it's dispersed in so many different dynamics. We need to figure out sort of how an under-resourced city like ours, can sort of take a common data set and be able to pull it together sort of through a co-designed process with the citizens who are affected the most by these particular hazards, and then come up with strategies to mitigate, but actually to transform and adapt to the climate-induced hazards that that plague us. And those of us like Freetown that are in sort of coastal cities that are the most exposed and the most vulnerable, and then have large populations, 35% of our population, as I said, sort of are informal. Those are the people who every year suffer these dynamics. And as the dynamics shift, like for instance, what we're expecting is that we're going to have a massive problem with heat. And so sort of the heat island effect sort of on our city will be great. And we know this. And so we're now using all of our data, and one of these slides, the last slide, looks at what we know about heat stress. And then on the basis of what we understand about heat stress, we're looking at sort of how we actually systematically address it. So we're about to move into a partnership with NOAA out of the US so that we can actually do urban heat mapping. That will help us to systematically, and we're going to use the community-based dynamics that we already have in place for actually measuring risk continuously, then to build sort of an urban heat island mapping system that will help us to better understand what the dynamics of heat are in the long run. And then the 1 million trees, which will be 2 million, which will be 3 million trees that we plant, need to be planted in strategic locations to address these issues, along with other dynamics around sort of addressing the building materials, green roofs, those kinds of dynamics within specific vulnerable communities. I think I will stop there, and I hope this was somehow helpful.
I think it was, Eric, and really thanks a lot. I saw a positive, very positive comments in the chat, and it's truly, I think, an inspiration for many of us what you are doing in your city and your country. And I like the fact that you you shifted your presentation by starting with like the problem. What is the problem, and the fact that defining the problem needs to be done with the people locally. Also, if I may, I think another key success factor in your experience is the strong leadership, but also strong ownership of the process, not only by you, but by the whole, by the whole city and by the mayor. So again, congratulations, and we will continue to follow your work and hopefully work with you. So I'm going now to invite Philippe Hippolyte, with working from the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team and based in Saint Lucia, to share his experience of how to support communities to contribute to digital public goods, such as the OpenStreetMap platform. So Philippe, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Pierre. How's everybody doing? I'd like to also present, I promise I won't be too long. Is it possible for me to?
It should be now.
Share. Let's see. I literally only have like 2 slides, so. Okay, how's that looking?
Looking good.
All right. Once again, my name is Philippe Hippolyte. I am a project manager with Humanitarian OpenStreetMap in the Open Cities project, which is now featured in the Caribbean. Humanitarian OpenStreetMap is pretty much NGO that focuses on Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, which we call affectionately HOT. Focuses on OpenStreetMap platform, where we do mapping for an open platform for various segments, really focusing a lot on disaster resilience, building communities, and just really populating the general layers of OpenStreetMap in the OpenStreetMap platform. Earlier was mentioned about the Haiti incident, and following up on that, Humanitarian OpenStreetMap has really fostered that community development of creating mappers that could really respond to both sudden shocks, as well as just overall just generate a lot of data for humanitarian use in general. Just to be quick, the Open Cities project started off in Southeast Asia and was very successful, and then it moved more towards the regions of Africa, and then now, so the Latin America version is actually trying to bring that successful model across to, I would say, this part of the world, where there isn't that much of a presence of OpenStreetMap as strong as some of these other areas. So obviously Latin America and Caribbean region covers from Mexico and Central America all the way south to South America, as well as the Caribbean chain and all the islands involved. The project itself is focused on building disaster resilience, as well as fostering the capabilities for vulnerable communities in that region. Primarily for this Latin America and Caribbean portion, you have the Swiss Re being a funding agency, and GFDRR is our collaborating agency, with HOT being the implementing agency. So with this effect, we collaborate and foster on the ground the ability to generate mapping in the OpenStreetMap platform. It's really generating something where it really hasn't happened before. Again, with the Caribbean especially being vulnerable to hurricanes every year, landslides. Obviously, all the Caribbean is coastal communities and a very strong coastline in Latin America as well. Flooding is quite a serious issue. And of course, culturally and regionally, there's just a lot of other functions that go along with it. So building on that, some of the problem statements that we have looked at in some of our regions, and just to mention the regions that we're looking at as a pilot for now, would be Mexico, Guatemala in Central America. And then we have Jamaica, St. Lucia, and Dominica in the Caribbean. And again, these are just pilots to see how we can grow this OpenStreetMap community and that mentality of open data and sharing open geographic data for policy and decision-making in these developing nations. Going back to some of the problem statements, we have solid waste mapping and its connection to urban flooding. Jamaica actually in particular has quite a bit of issues with pollution within the areas of Kingston, and a lot of the pollution ends up in the harbors, and it's a complex problem that they're struggling with. So one of the things we're going to do is really focus on how getting a better understanding with the mapping, with probably some time series and other tools to figure out what's happening, where is it coming from, and to help the agencies such as solid waste and infrastructure ministries to get their hands wrapped around the problems. That's just one of them. Many other we have, such as in Dominica, we're trying to do some vulnerability assessments of some of the most vulnerable communities. And from a recent hurricane that hit in Dominica, really ravaged the island, and they're still reeling from it. Some of the images that you see here are from Dominica, and rebuilding is quite a challenge for them. So to do some vulnerability assessments in the island would help get a better picture. And then just in general, we're building communities of the OpenStreetMap community. As you can tell, some of the islands are very small, so capacity of mapping and just geospatial use is very limited, especially as developing countries and small island developing states, as well as in Latin America. So fostering that and growing that, as it is done so well in Southeast Asia and parts of Africa, we're just trying to grow that model of the open cities in this part of the world. So again, some of the challenges that we have are really building awareness. A lot of these communities don't have just a mentality that fosters collecting data and understanding geographic data. So we have to build awareness in some of these communities, and that has definitely been a challenge with that low uptake of, especially just in open mapping, and also just for validation and data collection. Quite a few presenters before me I heard speak on data validation, and it's very important. And that's one of the things that HOT actually focuses on. We have several tools that focus on creating areas where mappers can go in and pick a target area, reduce the duplication efforts, as was mentioned earlier, and be able to take data sets that were in there and then fix and get it up to standard. So getting validators along with data collectors and have both of them switch roles kind of helps build the idea of how to collect data properly and how to validate properly. One of the bigger challenges is, which is better, large volumes of data collectors and validators, or higher quality data collectors and validators? Sometimes, especially in the open community, you have a lot of people just getting data and not necessarily being responsible about it and creating quality data. In areas like this part of the world in Latin American Caribbean, it's great to get the maps populated because there is such little information there, but is it coming at a cost down the road? So a big challenge is to foster good, responsible, and quality mapping and validating. Validating is obviously not necessarily the most fun activity, but to find persons who have that way of getting data to be validated and being on it constantly is quite a challenge to get that pool of persons to be interested in doing that on a regular basis. And speaking of a regular basis, part of it is to build that sustainability. The Open City Project Latin America is funded for 2 years. And again, somebody mentioned what's going to happen when the project's done. Is it just something for the project and as soon as funding's done, it's gone? The idea is to really build that sustainability and that mentality and those communities, a culture of mapping and quality mapping to feed up. And when the confidence is built within some of these communities, the agencies, the governments, and other NGOs can now start depending and relying on open mapping data products, such as OpenStreetMap and what Humanitarian OpenStreetMap is looking to produce. And hopefully we can foster further activities in other parts of Latin America, Caribbean with this Open Cities Latin America and Caribbean project. That's all I have for now, Pierre. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Philip, and I thank you with really important questions. One on, of course, the acceptance and the trust in those data, and in particular when it comes from open platforms such as OpenStreetMap. The other on the quality of the product, and I would also add how to communicate about the quality of the information that you share. I think there was also a point raised by Tiziana on that, and how you increase the quality, and also how you increase information on the quality of the products that you actually deliver. And the question, of course, on the sustainability, but that you also addressed. And so we just presented one digital public good, which is also actually what we call a digital common, in the sense that it's not only used by communities, but also governed by community. And now I would like to invite another digital common, which is Wikipedia. And for that, we have Alex Stinson, working on Wikimedia, is going to tell us how it's been, leveraging the platform for disaster and risk purposes. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you. Yeah, can you see the screen? Hear me well?
Yeah.
Are we good? Excellent. Hi, I'm Alex Stinson. I'm a senior program strategist at the Wikimedia Foundation. I'm based in Uruguay, but originally from the US. And I'm also a Wikipedia volunteer. So I'm gonna kind of describe both feelings, experiences of that. When I got the invite, it was interesting because I was like, oh, we don't have a humanitarian OpenStreetMap in the Wikimedia community. We don't have that kind of flavor of work, but we do have kind of an organic community working around disaster and risk communication. And we have kind of communities that are growing in response to the climate crisis and other kinds of crises. And so I want to describe a bit the dynamic that's going on in our environment. So we learned through COVID that we're in a pretty good position to respond to global crises. About 7,000 Wikipedia articles were created in the 8 months after the international attention to COVID in 188 languages, and they involved 100,000 contributors. This is a non-trivial thing as the public started paying attention to this crisis, and a non-trivial number of people turned to us, especially in those early moments when there was a lot of confusion and lack of understanding around COVID. About 600,000 page views, or 600 million page views to these articles. And that's only the core COVID articles. I believe there's more. And this had ripple effects into the kinds of kind of proactive public health knowledge that you would need to prevent a crisis like COVID. Like readers traveled in, here's just 2 articles where you can see the traffic as the COVID crisis hit, it traveled over into these other topics. This is kind of as experts have described, Wikipedia is kind of an encyclopedia with breaking news. Wikipedia is a responsive platform to public attention, as much as it is an encyclopedia. Like an encyclopedia is a place where people collect knowledge and put context around things, but it's also a response to where is the public paying attention? How do we give answers to that? but also it has that connectivity effect that I described with spillover and zoonosis, where the public's paying attention to COVID, but because the way we link knowledge across Wikipedia, it's a huge graph, 6.5 million, or 6.5 million articles in English, about 50 million articles across all of our language Wikipedias. All of that's a big network graph. And so when people started learning about COVID, they also started learning about all of the public health topics that surrounded that. And so when we think about disasters, and this is a disaster that I stumbled upon when I was an English Wikipedia volunteer in 2015, there was an ecological mine disaster in the US where a mine tailings pond collapsed and it spread out toxic water that affected the Navajo Nation and several other communities in the Western US downstream with lead acid and other contamination in the water. That article quickly went, I happened to catch it in the news. And within 2 days, we had a pretty substantial article that was doing lots of kind of public communication about what the downstream effects of this ecological disaster were. And this is the kind of breaking news experience. And this is the article today. And the important thing to note is all the page views were in those early days of the disaster. The public was like, what the heck is going on? How do I wrap my head around this? There's a lot of attention, but then that record of the disaster has stayed around. So part of the reason I chose this one is 6 years ago, this happened, and you can see spikes when the Navajo Nation sues the federal government about this disaster, when various commentaries or other activities have been happening in subsequent. So Wikipedia kind of acts as institutional history on the thing we know about the crisis that we experience. And we expect that to happen with COVID too. That the continuous kind of turn back to what happened with this disaster. And I think as the climate crisis hits, we're starting to see the same thing happen to weather events. So this is the floods that are happening yesterday, today. Tiny article right now in the Northwest in the US and Canada. The last few weeks, flooding in Bosnia and India. A few months ago, when there was that really intense series of floods globally happening because of climate change, that documentation is happening on Wikipedia. And it's happening in a way where we have institutional memory, but we're also, again, connecting up to was the flood response, flood reaction data, concepts such as, installing flood walls, that kind of thing. The readers are going from these breaking news events out into the contextual disaster management knowledge that's also captured on the wiki. I spend most of my time paying attention to climate change and human rights and sustainability. So I kind of have data paying attention to that. We've identified about 3,500 English Wikipedia articles about climate. They have about 125 million page views a year. That's just the core articles. If you just draw a slightly larger circle with these disasters around it, we're probably talking billions of page views every year to the climate crisis. And that's just that one angle. There are kind of many other ways you can slice and dice it. English Wikipedia is only about 40% of the total page views to the climate communication. The other 60% is on another 180 languages, give or take. So it's not only that we're a center for the main languages and say scholarship or news or other communication is happening on, right? But it also trickles out into spaces like Swahili and local languages in Africa to different parts of Latin America where it matters. And part of, as I've been emphasizing, the thing that's happening now is our community is starting to realize oh, we need to respond to this kind of increasingly more complicated world with connectivity. And so here's an edit I did not too long ago in my volunteer capacity, where I just took the Chesapeake Bay article and on Wikipedia, which is this is a bay that has sea level rise already affecting it in the US, and just said, it's experiencing sea level rise. Read about sea level rise. Read about climate change in this context in the beginning of the article. And that kind of brought people who are asking questions like, what is this Chesapeake Bay? into the context of like how risk, disaster, climate change, mitigation, adaptation is affecting them. Until I got the invitation for this meeting, there was an article about risk communication on Wikipedia. Again, in my volunteer time, I added that. There's a lot of kind of baseline knowledge where public decision makers, say in government, in the journalism space, are kind of asking, should we worry about risk communication? Probably yes. What is this thing? Those kinds of questions are answered by Wikipedia. And something we learned during COVID too is the big tech platforms like Facebook and Google are starting to use Wikipedia as kind of a check and balance on misinformation and disinformation in all these languages too. So if the right answer isn't on Wikipedia, or the expert supported answer, or the well contextualized and well referenced answer is not there, it puts us in a really challenging position as, say, news strikes. Something happens where government fails to do good risk communication, and then suddenly everyone's like, what's this thing? Are there experts? How should we learn about these experts? All of that like first level entryway into the issue is not covered. We also experience a lot of systemic bias as like OpenStreetMap, as many of these other platforms. The global north drives much of our kind of attention sometimes. This is true of like, this is a graph of all the geocoordinates we have in the big database in the back of Wikipedia. You can see we have some pretty glaring gaps, but I think this also often reflects other open data sets. So this is something we're very aware of. But we also have partners who've been very good at identifying this problem. So CDKN and Future Climate for Africa produce these how-to guides for editing about climate change in Wikipedia. We've seen similar how-to guides for medicine, for other topics. This is something that NGOs do on a regular basis. And so if we're thinking about that kind of last mile to decision maker communication that needs to be on a public good site, like this is something we can build community around. In our Latin American and Spanish speaking community, they've been really effective at identifying some of these kind of mitigation risk adaptation issues that are starting to hit the press and be hot topics, and really putting them in context. This is an article on deforestation in Argentina. And you can kind of see as the conversation about what is deforestation, how is it affecting us, goes through the news cycles in Argentina. You see the page views on this article just spike. And they spike over and over again. And you also get it out into some of the other kind of, what is the risk? What are these other articles that are getting linked to? What are the causes of this? So kind of awareness and preparedness is very much attached to the kind of information that's there. So that's kind of my, and here's a good example of kind of where like known risk is just not being connected. So the Benin setting article on English Wikipedia had about 10,000 page views, and up until a couple months ago, there was no conversation about flood management, urban heating, climate change. But when you read the news, local news and local scholarship occasionally has this like intense attention to how these risks are being managed. But very little kind of contextual knowledge about people learning about the city had that information on the article. All of these are things that a general public can do. And that's what CDKN and Future Climate for Africa have been working on, is like, how do we get, activists, science communicators, and experts to contribute to this utility. So that's kind of like a general overview of what I know about what's going on in Wikimedia. And again, we don't have the open humanitarian OpenStreetMap kind of response team, but our community and the dynamic within it makes us a really good platform for supporting, I think, the kinds of communication that needs to happen around these topics we've been talking about today.
This is something we should create a specific team dedicated to disaster response. thanks a lot, Alex. I think it was a great overview of how we can leverage the Wikipedia platform. And I'd be curious to hear from you, your advice or maybe suggestions to people here, like international organizations, governments, and so on, how we can leverage Wikipedia and also Wiki tools a bit better. So thanks again. And now I'd like to invite Shanna McLean from NASA. So Shanna has many hats, but she's been, let's say, working a lot with building partnerships with international stakeholders, but also building partnership and capacities with local communities. And of course, also NASA is a provider of public goods, great public goods for a long time. So really happy to have you, Shanna, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Actually, I think you were going to say some of what I was going to say already, so that worked out well. So I don't have a presentation. I hope it's okay that I'm just going to make a few points, I think, based on some of what we've heard today, but also, of course, what's specific to this session, which is this concept of risk communication. But I really have enjoyed all of the different perspectives today. And risk communication is really a core function of all that we do across NASA, whether it's like understanding risk in relation to the development of our missions, or it's actually communicating the benefit of the science that we do to different communities. And so I'm going to just share maybe a few perspectives that I have from the NASA Earth Sciences Division, and then also the Applied Sciences program, where I tend to focus a lot of my work. So maybe first, I'd start by noting that NASA, particularly the Earth Sciences Division, and much to what Pierre just said, we are totally focused on open access and the concept of digital public goods. And so it's something that not only do we drive forward in everything that we do, but it's also what we use the trust of our agency and of our science to build and leverage that into how our partners end up, essentially approaching these concepts as well. And so we make data free and open, but we also have partnerships with ESA, JAXA, CNES, and so many others to really strengthen these approaches. And some of it's, through specific portals that we develop together, but some of it's just the goodwill that we try to have. Second, from maybe an interoperability perspective, which is another form of communication, I'd mentioned that we're also really aware, I think acutely aware, frankly, that a lot of the missions that we've developed were never done so with interoperability in mind, which when I started at NASA, kind of blew my mind, frankly. I thought maybe we were better than that, but it turns out we've gotten the clue. And so over the next decade, we are preparing to launch a series of satellites referred to as the Earth System Observatory. And so it'll really improve data interoperability from our data, of course, but it'll be on elements such as aerosols, cloud convection, precipitation, but also mass change, surface deformation, and then surface biology and geology. All of this, of course, is essential to guiding efforts relating to climate change and disaster risk reduction. Third, I would say that, and this has been noted throughout, the role of partnerships is really how you then communicate all of this work at a different level, or at different levels. And so some of what we do is really focus on building partnerships with cloud environments, such as what's provided with Google and the Google Earth Engine, Microsoft and Azure and their planetary computing environment, and then also Amazon. Because this allows not only people to have access to our data, which can often be challenging to access through all of our data centers, et cetera, but it also offers people opportunities to play with the data and manipulate it in ways that allow them to assess different changes. And so I really can't stress enough the value of partnership. We've mentioned a lot of the challenges that come with multiple portals and platforms, but through partnerships, we can really focus at NASA on not on building the next platform, but on ensuring that our data is integrated and available to all of the services that already exist. And so finally, really to translate all of the data and the information that all of us have access to into decisions and to better communicate it to decision makers on the ground, we also increase partnerships with a number of humanitarian actors and with insurance sectors and other sectors, of course. But frankly, I'm probably partnering with a number of you in some capacity. We've got partnerships, of course, with the Red Cross, the World Bank, OpenStreetMap, and parts of the UN. And so, but we also have a large number of domestic and international activities that focus on human-centered design approaches and capacity building to ensure greater translation and use of all the services that are available. And maybe I'll just close by saying that we have a new administration in the U.S. government. This has led to some positive changes in the climate and risk reduction sphere, and so NASA is responding to that by building a new program and a suite of capabilities on climate change and resilience. And we also have a number of current efforts that are really focused on downscaling climate projections and getting other more localized products into the hands of people like all of us in this room or this virtual room that are interested in risk reduction, disaster response, or resilience. And so I would say that part of the reason why I like discussions like this is because I can learn from all of you on what the challenges you see being faced, and anything that I can do within my role at NASA to address them is certainly something that I'm interested in doing. And so with that, I'll close there. Thanks so much.
Thanks to you, Shanna. And I see that we are nearing the end already of the workshop, so maybe I'll go directly to the wrap up. But again, thanks again to all the speakers. Really been fantastic conversations for the 3 sessions, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity to follow up. And also thanks again to colleagues at GFDRR and UNDRR. It's been a real pleasure to organize this workshop together. And now, as words of closure, I'd like to hand over to Jenty.
Thank you very much for that, Pierre. And I will also be brief. No, I think it's been an incredibly rich discussion. And I think that Shanna, in her last statements, I think made a lot of the points that I would have liked to make about the importance of partnerships, how exciting it is to learn of the multiplicity of different initiatives. And the point here is not to develop a perfect single risk model or indices, but it's to allow that innovation and that targeting and that community engagement to get the sort of tools we need. So I think today's discussion has really given us incredible food for thought in terms of, we've been recording the discussion. We will be reflecting that hopefully in our short paper that you've got that draft, but I think there's a lot of things that have come out from that. But I also very much take a lot of the points on board about the need to cooperate more, keep this discussion going. And so perhaps Pierre, Stuart, and the wider team, we can find ways of looking at keeping a light touch, but also building on this discussion, because I think it's been really fruitful. And I just want to very much thank everyone for their time, and to assure you that, I think we've got a unique moment now to further this debate. I think that issues like the COVID crisis and climate change have drawn a new attention to risk and the need for better understanding of risk and cascading impacts. So let's leverage that moment and really try and move this forward. So huge thanks to you all, and particularly to the colleagues from GFDRR who put this idea to us a couple of months back. And it seemed a bit of a complicated and was it going to work idea, but I'm so glad that we managed to bring you all together, and it's been a fantastic day. And you will be hearing from us. Any last words, Pierre? Anything I missed? Stuart, anyone?
No, I don't think we need. So thanks, yeah, thanks again, and see you soon, everyone.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys. Have a good morning, evening, wherever you are.
Bye-bye.